Today we're lucky to be hearing from Rinat, who just arrived yesterday, and Rinat has been coming for a long time now, and she's a psychiatrist and a psychotherapist in Los Angeles. She really focuses on the client-practitioner relationship. She works a lot on minimizing medication management with all sorts of clients, including those experiencing extreme states. And she's always been interested in the alternatives to conventional psychiatry. And she's also a faculty and supervisor at our new school for existential psychoanalysis. And she always just has this really awesome way of sort of weaving in her work and relationships with patients. I don't know if she'll do that this time, but she's always had this way of breathing life into the clinical situation, person to person. So we're really lucky to be hearing from her.
Thank you, James. Okay, so before I start, I just want to share some thoughts. I realized that being here at Esalen feels very healing to me, and I assume to a lot of you guys. Then I thought, well, what's healing about being here? Of course, the beauty, but I think it's that connection to nature, and that at the essence of healing, there is connection. It's about being connected to oneself and the environment. But that's not what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about 3 other components of healing that came up to me when I tried to explore that question of what is healing. So as the question came up, I realized that one cannot ask what is healing without first exploring what is illness. A author that I've been reading much of lately is Gabor Mate. Don't know if you guys have had a chance to look at his books, but he has a book called The Myth of Normal: Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture. There he explores personality features which he claims are related to chronic illness. Gabor Mate sees the mind-body psyche as interrelated, a concept which is in and of itself still controversial in modern medicine. The features or traits that are discussed are as follows. 1, an automatic and compulsive concern for the emotional needs of others while ignoring one's own. Another is a rigid identification with social roles, duties, and responsibilities. Another is overdriven, externally focused, multitasking, hyper-responsibility based on the conviction that one must justify one's existence by doing and giving. Repression and healthy self-protective aggression and anger, and harboring and compulsively acting out 2 beliefs. I'm responsible for how other people feel, and I must never disappoint anyone. These traits are highly normalized in our society, meaning they're not regarded as contributing to illness, and often develop in childhood as a way of navigating our needs to survive households that withhold love, are critical, violent, or intrusive and neglectful. In other words, the need for survival and therefore attachment are both highly connected and ultimately become our basic needs, and we believe allow us to survive, and ultimately are innately sometimes are opposed to what we need to heal and be authentic. Gabor Mate realizes that many of the qualities that we assume are us and that we take pride in are actually scars of where we lost connection to ourselves. So today I would like to look at what can heal the rift or disconnect in our own inner selves, which may begin in our body or mind, but ultimately impacts our entire being. The first and most obvious symptom of illness is pain. Pain that begins in the form of discomfort, a feeling of deep sadness or meaninglessness, or alternatively, pain that manifests in lack of physical or emotional energy and or physical aches and pains. In other words, pain is our first wake-up call or trigger that calls us to pursue a shift or change from our current condition of illness. Pain often inspires us, and if it's severe, forces us to seek healing. Our own internal disconnect may be so extreme that the idea of healing may not even cross our minds. Sadly, the solutions that our society offers are often focused on pain eradication in the form of medicines or procedures that cover up or numb our pain, but do not ultimately lead to true healing. Nevertheless, if we learn how to work with pain, it becomes our ultimate ally in self-healing. Pain wants us to embrace it and allow it to be our guiding light. As pain undulates in strength and weakness, it takes us through a journey of growth and evolution, away from our perceived adaptive self, the self of self-negation, to a self of individuation. But given that we often become ill and need to heal from the same mindset that got us there to begin with, we actually need a helper, a mentor of sort that would guide us through our journey. In order for the guidance to be healing, it entails a few necessary qualities. 1, the guide has to be connected and dedicated to the precepts of healing. 2, the guide and the patient are creating and developing a love bond. And 3, the individual that is in the process of healing submits to the leadership of the guide. These 3 ideas seem simple, but they each entail subtleties of connection that are often found in other relationships. For example, relationships that are parental and relationships that are loving. The relationship with the guide is one of harmony, trust, and attunement, reminiscent of the good enough parent. Given that most of our illness began in response to challenges in childhood, the guide takes on being a participant in healing the past, present, and future. As Gabor Mate states, children's sense of security, trust in the world, interrelationships with others, and above all, connection to their authentic emotions hinge on the consistent availability of attuned, non-stressed, and emotionally reliable caregivers. The more stressed or distracted the latter, the shakier the emotional architecture of the child's mind will be. The message of the good guide or an adequate parent is that the human who is healing is lovable and welcomed exactly the way they are. In other words, the guide helps the patient find its authentic feelings and therefore healing. Therefore healing in a society that is so socially conformist that it disallows the individual to find their true nature. There are many fascinating aspects to healing. I would like to focus on one more dimension, which is the value of the journey versus immediacy in the healing process. Again, we live in a world that is both toxic and limiting to our own nature and self-love. One of the limitations is the need for quick results. Very often, the idea of healing gets shoved to the side in favor of finding a cure, or as we said previously, elimination of pain. The journey of healing entails self-acceptance and understanding. Our beliefs that we are innately worthy of blame or fear of letting others down, chronic guilt of not being deserving, and self-loathing become embedded in our psyche as equivalent with having an identity. It is the slow and patient work of connecting with these parts of our psyche in a loving way that allows them to soften up and release their hold on us, which ultimately becomes the backbone of our healing process. Gabor Mate added this really adorable story, which I want to read to you guys. He says this, he says, "Once upon a time, our wholeness was lost to us when our star team of inner friends, guilt, self-hatred, suppression, denial, and the rest came abroad to keep us safe. We were barely involved in the hiring process and mostly didn't notice them as they went about their business. Like a cadre of reality TV design experts, they sat about remodeling our personalities so that we'd make stout of childhood in one piece. Beautifying certain rooms and boarding up others, installing alarms, locking the cellar door, but their success at keeping us intact required that we emerge into adulthood with core parts of ourselves walled off. They were good at their job. After many years of living in this stuffy, segmented home, we came to long for a more spacious, better ventilated existence. So we thanked the experts for their service and sent them out for a well-deserved sandwich. And we devoted ourselves gently but diligently to a new task, the literal antidote to the psychic dismemberment required of us long, long ago. the task of remembering ourselves. One last thing that I want to mention, I'm sure I actually read last night. So a few weeks ago, the New York Times dedicated its entire journal to various dimensions of therapy. And in one article called Leaving Therapy, the author, her name is Karina Delval-Shorsky, she says this at the end. She said, "We all have to figure out how to want the help we need. The choices we make about how to get it matters less than how close we can feel to the force of our choosing." That's it.
All right. Well, now we can thank you so much, Rinat. That was great.
Thanks.
So, we can open it up for questions, and we should have quite some time to get the conversation going.
Thanks, James. Is this on?
Yes, it's on.
Oh. Thanks, Rinat. That was really lovely. It's certainly fitting in with the whole theme that we've been talking about for the last day or two. I was just wondering, so you made a distinction between coming to therapy for healing and just to get rid of your pain. And I was wondering what proportion of your patients do you feel come for the one or for the other, or is it all the same for you?
Well, I think most people make it to therapy because of some pain and they want to get rid of their pain. But the idea, or the way I work with people, is to help them understand that their pain is not an enemy to get rid of, but it's their ally, and to develop an intimate relationship with their pain, embracing of pain. And that's what leads to healing over time. It's a slow process. It could be a slow process.
Do all of them embrace it, or some never get it?
It's a slow process to get people to embrace it to begin with.
Thank you, Rinat. How do you think we could make people understand that it is a slow process? Because they, as you said, they want to be quick. So it's very hard, I think, to make them understand that it's a slow process. I totally agree. But they want fast results, right?
Well, everything now is about, the faster the better. That's the society we created. That's why Gabor Mate, I love the title of his book, where he says, illness and healing in a toxic culture. So the culture is toxic, and therefore the culture breeds parents who are highly stressed, highly disconnected. He speaks about his own disconnect from self as he was raising his own children. It's a great question. I do not know how to answer it, except that I try in my own little world to bring an antidote to what we are being raised with. And yeah.
What was making me think that a challenge, it seems to me, is healing in the context of a toxic culture. So, some forms of therapy have been criticized as being sort of healing towards adaptation to a toxic culture, so kind of fitting in. How do you feel there's a tension that you kind of have to work with in therapy, where you're kind of facilitating this attitude towards pain, towards patience, not wanting it to move too quickly and all of that, and yet the patient is going out into the world and also simultaneously trying to, adapt, to work, to function.
Right, I mean, if I understand, James, so there's like two opposite forces that are both so strong, right? Society that wants us to fit into a toxic culture, that's one force. And the other force of wanting to not feel pain. There's going to be pain that emanates as a result of that adaptation. So that becomes another force. And often the toxic culture ideals take over, right? Like, okay, let's prescribe the medicine to knock off the pain, and the pain does get knocked off. But that's not to be confused with real healing.
Thank you so much for your talk, Rinat. Love Gabor Mate. I haven't read that one yet, though, so I'll definitely have to check it out. As you were talking about this, I was thinking about the idea of sort of embracing, integrating your pain as a way to heal. And I definitely think along those lines in my own work, and I was thinking about some ways in which that might show up. And I think working with people on sort of things happening in the here and now, I can think of two examples that come up in my work a lot. One is working with anxiety. And I think the idea of embracing your pain can be kind of a lot for some people. But I found that the idea of increasing your tolerance for anxiety, like your tolerance to a poison, seems to be a lot more acceptable. What's nice about that is people can see progress around that gradually. You can go out to a crowded restaurant all of a sudden, and that's like a huge accomplishment. If you're kind of agoraphobic or something like that. Another one that I think about in relation to my own work is connecting with the meaning for why you're doing something painful right now. Really common one I see is stressed out parents raising kids, which can be very painful but also very meaningful. So helping them, I think, to explore the reasons why is this a meaningful experience for you, even though it's difficult, seems to be helpful. Just the here and now issues, I guess. But thanks.
Yeah, I know one aspect of your work is helping people come off medications. I was wondering if you could speak to that and give an example or two.
Helping people get off of medications is a very individualized process. I mean, some people come and they're ready to get off their meds. They intuitively know that there is a readiness there, and it's very easy to kind of walk the journey with them as they do it, and they might feel a little bit sensitive and maybe more exposed to a vaster spectrum of emotions, etc. But there's an internal readiness. With other people, the medicines have become a substitute for something that hasn't been created yet. And so let's call it some sort of an internal strength, I would say, that hasn't yet been established. And with those people, taking away the medicines has to be substituted with another process, another thing that needs to develop or occur internally. So they want, for example, make it to the psych ward, which it can be really traumatic. From my experience, it's not. Usually it becomes pretty apparent in the relationship which person is ready for what, and so sometimes getting off of meds can be months or years of a process to get there, and sometimes it can be very quickly with a person who's done a lot of inner work, and they were placed on medicines 5 years ago and the doctors never made any shifts or changes, but something has grown in them in the meantime. One of the issues though that I have with medicines is I think that medicines often hinder that internal process, so that's another paradox. the pain level is not there to inspire that internal struggle. So, I don't know, am I answering your question, Will? Okay.
Thank you, Rinat, for your introduction to me, you raised the issue of attachment and trauma. And so, I used to think that early life, the attachment to parents, the developmental traumas that children would be subjected to within their family unit would be the bedrock for personality formation, and that would lead to vulnerabilities to develop more clinical types of symptoms and syndromes later in adolescence and adulthood. But you introduced the notion of the toxicity of our modern culture, and I mean, I can witness some young kids that, like I was raised, as you were as well, before the age of the internet. And it's like everything changed almost gradually, but a seismic shift to me when I heard the young pop star Billie Eilish talking about being completely screwed up by looking at porn at the age of 11 and seeing how a girl and a woman should be with men in relationships and the distortions of what that brought about. It really made me rethink these prejudices I had about everything boiling down to early life. And I'm wondering if you might be able to comment a bit about, do you see this in your own practice, the toxicity of modern culture and how it's impacted on people?
There are so many aspects of this toxic culture, right? Like maybe I touched one, which is the attachment to quick cure, right? You're mentioning another one which has to do with exposure to inappropriate material, which is of course another aspect of the trauma, of the toxic culture. I mean, I'm sure if we sit here and think, we can come up with another 10 or 20 or 30, aspects. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. I wanted to, could you make any comments about the current research on using microdosing and psychedelics in therapy?
I cannot comment about it because I haven't taken the information in per se. I did a fellowship last year that has to do with plant medicine, and I came out of the fellowship feeling that all our healing is already available to us within ourselves and our own biochemistry. I wasn't mesmerized by additionals. In other words, yeah, one can use psychedelics and MDMA and microdosing and it might trigger something, but I also think that I ultimately am seeing those substances once again as substances, mind-altering substances, maybe a little different than psychopharmacology, but I still have a gravitation to what would you call the mystery of our entire being as is, without external manipulation per se.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, I also see the split in what you're talking about in the world of grief. And there's a big controversy, for instance, with the new DSM diagnosis of persistent grief disorder, where it's diagnosed if you're still having any elements of a grief reaction after a year. and particularly for those of us who know about or work with traumatic grief, and my specialty is working with people after suicide loss, that does not resolve after a year. And taking something that is normative, and in the models that luckily people in the grief world are talking about, it's embracing the pain, seeing what's meaningful in the pain, moving through it rather than getting over it. But this is so antithetical to the medical model of grief, which is pathologizing what's absolutely essential and normative. So I really appreciate that,
Right, so our society decides this is how much time something takes, and it happens in like nearly every arena of our life, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. The question, what is healing? One thing I gained from your talk is the sense of that deep, true healing isn't really about a specific kind of area of someone's life, but it's always something that's, the sense of it's related to the existential totality of someone's life. It's kind of a feeling of significance. So if you treat like relationship problems in isolation or pain in isolation, it's maybe a form of healing, but true healing is a meaningful existential experience. That's the feeling I'm getting.
I can relate to that, yeah.
So thank you.
First thing I'd like to say is that Esalen, within the past year, put on a microdosing conference with James Fatima and a couple of other people. You're aware of it?
Sure.
Did you take it?
I was in Denver for the last conference.
Oh. There's a lot of great information given during.
The book is interesting.
Yeah.
Symphony of Sound.
So, I mean, I think my summary of microdosing is it's kind of like rebooting your computer, is something they said during that workshop. Not necessarily something profound, but you get a computer reboot on some level, and that's taking a whole day's worth and just putting it into one sentence. And I have a lot of people in my practice who are experimenting with it without. Well, some ask about it, but some definitely don't. They're doing it and sometimes following the Stamets protocol and sometimes not following it. And it's a crapshoot what's happening with the whole psychedelic movement at the moment, and I think it's something that's really interesting. And the 60s, the renaissance that's happening with it now, and I have a quote in my phone where some people said, this is a psychedelic bubble, and some people are going to go psychotic, and some people are going to die, and this bubble is going to burst. And it's interesting to think about the role of psychedelics in the process of healing. I do want to say that through my Vipassana practice, I early on came to say that pain was my greatest teacher. So how pain functions for somebody, eventually it can be something that you take on as a teacher. I also think of the term pain as a vague descriptor. And on some level, you're like this with your experience, pointing over there saying that's pain, but it's not really here, because what is pain? It's made up of physical sensations, there's emotional reactions to it. If you're looking at it from the mind of a meditator, it has components to it. So I just want to make that point. When I think about Ken Wilber and his 4-quadrant theory and culture and society as something to treat, I often think that I have no training about treating this thing I call the group mind. And I think somebody needs some kind of platform like Gandhi had to be able to really treat a group mind. And I think about our political landscape, and is there anybody that is evolved, that has the ability, or where are the psychologists or the psychiatrists on the national stage or in politics that are making an attempt to try to say, hey, yo, we all need to grow up or get beyond the narcissistic phase of development or our adolescence as a human culture. And I don't know necessarily where those people are, but that what comes to my mind when I think about treating this toxic culture or the group mind. I'd be interested in if you had any thoughts about treating the group mind or treating that instead of just complaining about
right,
it.
so you bring a super good point, which has to do with maturation. But I think part of the toxicity of the culture is that it celebrates immaturity. There is no like guidance of what it means to become an adult. I think those kind of guides existed in more tribal cultures, right? There's like a mentor but if the parents today are not healed, they're all kind of ill and stressed out, as we said, then they can't be the guide to show what maturation is. And so you see it on every level, political, down to like a teacher in school, I mean, you name it. The need for immediate gratification, immediately eradicating pain, that's the opposite of maturation, right? Process.
Thanks, Rinat. I had a question. If do you make a distinction between a patient who's in pain and someone who's suffering, but not necessarily what you would call being in pain?
That's a great question. I think they're so intertwined. I can't imagine somebody in pain not suffering.
I'm thinking of patients. I have a lot of patients who are not in pain. They're living their lives avoiding pain, but they're suffering from that. They're not alive.
Okay.
And so for them, I try to encourage them. You need to take more risk. Don't play so safe. They may be alone, afraid of dating, this kind of thing. They're just kind of living in a box somewhere. And for them, it would be good to get into their pain in order to heal. But they're not going to do that as long as they avoid pain.
So the suffering of pain avoidance.
Yes.
Yeah.
It reminds me of something that's been floating around as we've been talking is, you're next, okay. Were you raising your hand?
No,
No, you weren't, okay. Just hallucinating. Is the question, I think, of fear, because I think we talk a lot about, say, the experience of pain, but I think a lot of what it seems like the resistance of pain has something to do with fear. And we've been talking about psychedelics. I think when psychedelics are useful, it's often because they've brought you to not just experience pain. I think it's one of the problems of MDMA therapy is that you can experience a lot, but you experience it with a lot less fear. I mean, that's what the MDMA kind of does. And I think it limits how therapeutic it can be, while mushrooms and acid force you to confront your fear, not just the painful experiences on the other side, but to face the experience of fear itself. But I guess the question, I think, is in therapy and working towards pain, how does fear come up, and how do you see that as central as I do? And is that something that...
Yeah, well, that's a great point that you're bringing, James. feel like, so the opposite of fear would be courage, right? And the various levels of courage that people embody, or that it's almost like a capability of sorts to courageously go into the abyss. And I feel like I never, and I'm very rarely able to predict who could and who couldn't do that, you know?
Well, the literal meaning of courage is open-hearted, not brave.
I'm trying to remember a quote. Maybe somebody knows it, but suffering is the avoidance of legitimate pain. Who said that? Was that Freud or
Very
Jung?
Freudian. Freud would agree.
Yeah, it's very Freudian.
Oh, it's right next to you.
Hi, I'm Carol, and Sandy and I got in last night. Anyway, I'm not sure. This is sort of swirling around in my brain. I'm piggybacking a little on you, John, about the internet and what you said about Billie Eilish. And there seems to me that my daughter is an example, she's 34, of mental health issues coming out of the closet. And young people especially using the internet to talk about their mental health issues, but not necessarily in an oversharing way. Like my daughter had she's had 2 traumatic pregnancy losses in the last year. And when she had an ectopic pregnancy last fall, she, after kind of going through some of her own healing, she talked about it on Instagram. And another friend of hers who had postpartum depression was talking about it. But it was in a very respectful and open way that didn't feel like it was inappropriate or overly sharing or anything. So I don't know how this fits in here, but I just wanted to make mention of that and see if anybody has any comments on it.
Go ahead.
Oh, you do.
I'm glad you brought that up. I think that we all live in a media environment, and there are no environmental impact statement. And young people, the digital generation, this is evolving. We're watching this unfold. And I think it's interesting that she's mentioning that our daughter having brought this up on Instagram. It would never enter my mind to do anything like that. I imagine a lot of you wouldn't do it either. But it's a different cultural mindset for these young people who grew up in this, Facebook, Instagram generation. And we, of course, can raise questions, as older generations often do, about the insidious nature of emerging media and technology. Remember, television was the vast wasteland back in the 50s and 60s. I think that, going back to the toxic environments, that this is a response to what is perceived as a toxic environment, as an emerging environment that is not tied to old traditions, to tribal traditions, to the kinds of mentalities that existed previously. And that I think that these kids are inventing something using these social media. I'm not sure I like it, but I think we have to acknowledge that this is a way that they are dealing with some of their pain, although they don't talk about it that way, I don't think.
All right, one more comment, then I'll give it to you, Heather. Grief also. A friend of mine who lost her husband, she's 20 years younger than I am. She is openly talking about it on Facebook and Instagram, something I would never consider doing personally.
Heather? Oh.
I should have
She
a
can
couple
jump to
here.
that.
Will do.
So I don't have the internet, so I can't look it up. But I think the quote is neurosis is the avoidance of legitimate pain or legitimate suffering. And I think it's Jung.
But he's copying Freud.
It's very Freud. It's definitely
Yeah, you
Freud.
got
It's
it.
definitely
Of
from
course.
Freud.
You got it.
Absolutely.
Must be.
You got me there.
Heather, just before you, I'm gonna be right back.
I'm writing it down, I won't forget.
It was Jung.
Right.
The quote actually comes from the eminent psychologist Carl Jung. Neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. I'm here to help you, my brother.
So, I think it was just really nice that you mentioned on the ability of like being transparent in the internet and social media. I am from this new generation that use way more social media. I'm 27, and I do think and really believe that it's not ideal nowadays to be outside of social media. It's like avoiding something that is part of your society, but the thing is how you're gonna relate with it. And for me, it seems like relating in a way that you are being transparent and who you really are, and using it to become less shy, more self-expressed, get more self-knowledge, and work on vulnerability, be kind with other people and share this love. And yeah, I think it's really, can be a really important tool to even deal with your shyness, to put out there whatever you are feeling. Of course, always in unawareness of others, not being aggressive with others, but really putting everything that is inside. And I think it can be very healing in a way.
Heather, you ready?
Yeah. Ready.
Okay, so Sandy, you said the digital age, the cultural mindset, no tie to traditions, the tribal to traditions, but that there's this way that we see people, not just the young people, and Rinat, love to talk, the way that technology is now inventing the new traditions. I want to add in technology, that there's much more, it's not so much the kids or the young people. Okay, so then I wanted to say this to sort of see if I can make that sentence make sense. That what we're seeing with the compulsive nature of, the mind offloaded to the phone is something actually quite old. The way that the mind is embodied, distributed, embedded, the nature of self or mind or psyche, whatever you want to call it, this shows us, in a way, the indigenous knowledge, the ancient knowledge, the non-Western, non-dual knowledge, that self and nature, or self and world, or self and society are one. So yeah, they're creating new traditions, but I've tried to say this, and it may not make sense. Maybe someone can say it better, but the devices, the gaming, the social media, the medium is operating through that oneness, that the way that we're always already in a merger, a potential. Well, we're in a merger state already at an affective level. And I think, like my friend Marlon said, Succession is great. It's so great. And you can read about people watching it, and certain people watching it, talking about it. I said, why is it so great? He said, we live through them. We live through these characters. And I was like, no, we don't. The characters live through us. It's a parasite-host relationship. Our livingness, our lives are spent in front of the fucking TV, taking in all this really glorious content. It is glorious. It's great. But we don't live through them. It is through us that these stories are given life, and they use us to unfold themselves. And I think this is
I like the fact that people are talking about things on TikTok and Instagram and having connection, but I think there's a confusion as to, you know, like, I don't know how else to say it, I'll just sort of ramble off there. There's a confusion that the technology is what's more powerful than
Will's
there, that's good.
Taxi.
I'll leave it there.
I'll go real quickly. So when I am thinking about pain and suffering, I start to think about Buddhism, and I think there's often a misunderstanding and a mistranslation of the first noble truth, which is that life is suffering. But it's actually not life is suffering, but life is the Pali word dukkha, which translated doesn't really mean pain or suffering. It's more like misalignment. It's like a wheel that has a spoke going through it, but the spoke is off, so the wheel isn't flowing with the most energetic efficiency, which is a very different idea than pain or suffering. And then it makes me think of the origins of the word sin, which is not really bad or good. It's more, again, it's missing the mark. So there's something that comes into Taoism about, is there a conflict or is it just flowing? If I have a loss and I grieve and I express the grief, there's really not neurosis there, but I have a loss, the grief is there, but now I have a conflict with the grief because of something. Then I start to experience something more like neurosis.
Well, I see. Just real quick, anyone who hasn't said anything want to jump in at all?
Well, I want to say something.
Oh, of course. Well, you're the speaker. Jump in.
No. So, as Heather, what comes to mind, I think you come, and again, it's very organic what I'm going to say. You come from like trusting this oneness, yes, and what emanates from it. But I don't know if I trust it because we are destroying the plant and animal kingdom, and therefore creating a disconnect and a split from the one. So I'm having a hard time saying, okay, everything we do is this one, you know?
Yeah. When I say oneness, I do not mean anything filled with an idea. I mean a systemic, a process. There's always already a relationship. When I say oneness, I simply mean like a relational meta theory. I'm not talking about an idea of kumbaya unity. So yeah, sorry, I wasn't clear on that.
I wanted to respond to Carolyn's comments about, you know, young people and women in particular. I have a daughter who's your age too, and it seems to be common that when friends suffer, they will go on and disclose it, and you think about the risk that you take of exposing your life to the world, and that it's always surprising because one of her friends disclosed her eating disorder and lifelong mental illnesses, and all of the my daughter's husband and any buddy of this ilk goes, why would you do that? You've just put yourself out there, you know, everyone's from employers who's looking at you, is going to know. And I think in this person's knowing about her life, she had no one else to turn to. She couldn't contain the grief and anxiety, so she had to belt it out. Now, unfortunately, when people do this in good intentions, they're hoping that you're going to have a empathic audience, but then it can invite all the trolls that want to devalue, hate, displace their own rage and projection, and then it can make it 5 times worse for these people. So on one hand, you know, we have to start with the premise that we're all neurotic, meaning that it's human to experience anxiety. That's why Freud talked about, that we're ill in that way. It's just a matter of degree. We're all trying to find ways of dealing with things. So displacement, one of the most basic defenses, is that I find I can't kind of sit with whatever it is, and I have to then relocate my attention onto something else and focus on some little detail, such as the obsessiveness that we have in our cell phones, or whatever it may be, the next distraction, the game, to get away from the very thing that we really need to be sitting with. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's a deep pathology. It's just that this is, one attempt to try to ameliorate suffering, or get ourselves away from wallowing in that painful state all the time. But I'd be interested in a larger discussion about whether people find that healing, to reach out to the world with such hubris that they could be further victimized and further traumatized.
Okay.
John, many years ago, somebody from Wired contacted me wanting a comment from a media psychologist about at that time was a listserv for people who were agoraphobic. And some guy had invented this, and so, in a few months he'd signed up like 500 agoraphobics who were now talking to each other. And they wanted to know what I thought of that. And I gave them a much longer statement, but the only thing that ended up in Wired was the statement that a virtual life is better than no life at all. So I think that kind of sums it up.
Okay.
I'm just going to briefly respond to you, John. So the other side of that is, okay, so my daughter shared about her experience, but she's also in therapy. And she was also doing her own work around it, and she found people's responses were mostly, and maybe all, positive in terms of feeling more connected.
So Freud's name has been invoked a few times now about suffering, neurosis, etc. I just wanted to read this quote from Freud, and this was from a very early work with Joseph Breuer. It says, "Much will be gained if psychoanalysis can succeed in transforming hysterical misery into common unhappiness. With a mental life that has been restored to health, the individual will be better armed against that unhappiness." So he saw neurosis as a flight from being unhappy. That most of us are able to handle the periods of life that we're unhappy. We're always pursuing happiness. But the neurotic person can't bear those periods of unhappiness, so they take flight into these symptoms. It could be depression, anxiety, projecting things onto other people, you name it. And ironically, that kind of suffering, which is self-imposed, is preferable to a kind of suffering that is not self-imposed, that we have no control over. The slings and arrows of everyday life, But at least if we're neurotic, we created that in ourselves, and we have some fixation with it and attachment to it, which is why it's so difficult for us to give it up in therapy. So he didn't think that analysis makes you happy. It gets you to a point where you can accommodate the suffering of everyday unhappiness. Then you have a much better shot at pursuing happiness. Obviously, he's talking about neurosis in wildly fluctuating, degrees. But it's the idea that he was trying to get at, that there's a kind of suffering that life subjects us to, and then there's the kind of suffering that is self-imposed. And ironically, we often prefer the one that we impose on ourselves.
Straight. All right. I guess this will be last one. No, you're good.
I think this discussion about internet is very important, but I like to ask you, Rinat, about the role of therapy and the fear of therapy that I've been experiencing with some of my patients when I say I want to see you more, and they say, no, I cannot handle one more session a week. And they're not afraid of medicines, but they're afraid of therapy. If you experience this, thank you.
Well, I think that in therapy, ideally you expose the root of what leads to pain, and that can be very, very scary for people. And of course it also often leads to a shift in beliefs, right? People have a set of beliefs. My mom and dad loved me. I had a great childhood. And all of a sudden to find out that maybe that was not exactly the case. I think that changes, it can threaten the kind of infrastructure of one's identity. Whereas medicine is just a shift in emotional intensity of sort, right? I felt so many confusing feelings. All of a sudden, wow, I don't feel those feeling states anymore. Very opposite in a way. Yeah.
Well, thanks so much, Rinat. That was great.
Thank you.